How's it going, everybody? Hey, I am creating this video right now as a resource, an additional resource for the sermon that was preached last Sunday, what the Bible has to say about life, and for a greater assistance in your home group conversations. All throughout this past week, I've been receiving more questions, not rebuttals, but more questions about what the Talmud is necessarily, what the Septuagint is, and why it's relevant to the discussion. And it's not that there was a complete lack of understanding, but individuals, it's just a new concept and people are asking more questions about it. So this video is intended to be further clarification on what the Talmud is, what the Septuagint is, and what the difference is between Creationism and Traditionism as it pertains to when the soul is brought about in the body. So those three issues. Number one, I just want to talk about the Talmud. The Talmud was compiled and completed by the year 350 AD. So this is after the time period of Christ, and then another form of the Talmud, or maybe modifications to the Talmud, was concluded around 500 AD, which is called the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Talmud, again, is a number of writings, a number of commentaries, just as most pastors have commentaries on their bookshelf, pastors and scholars writing about certain Bible verses and interpretations. The Talmud is a collection of commentaries written by rabbis all the way from Jesus' day up until about 500 AD. So it's 500 years worth of a bunch of rabbis getting together and saying, here is how we interpret specifically the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In Jesus' day, he didn't refer to it as the Talmud, but in Jesus' day, he referred to it as the traditions of men. Matthew chapter 15, verses 2 through 9, Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees and the scribes for teaching the precepts of men and for making their interpretations authoritative. And then he came along and he taught what the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, was supposed to be saying. The scribes and the teachers of the law actually numbed down the law to merely being something that's external in nature. And then Jesus came along and said, hey, listen, you got the interpretation way off. It's actually more obedience than just an external performance. I'm calling for your heart in the matter. So Jesus came along in his ministry and he rejected the interpretations of the Talmud from the rabbis of the day. He called it the traditions of men. And he rebukes the Pharisees in Matthew 15. He rebukes the Pharisees in Mark chapter 7, saying that because they have elevated the traditions of men above the Word of God, they've actually invalidated the Word of God altogether. Here's why that's important. Here's why it's important to understand what the Talmud is then. It's important to understand what the Talmud is because a number of individuals who want to claim a pro-choice position and use the Bible to do so, whether they realize it or not, their interpretations on certain passages are being influenced by the thinking of the rabbis, the non-Christian rabbis from the Talmud. So I would say it's an illegitimate interpretation because it's not Christians coming and saying, this is how we view the Torah. It's people who have actually rejected Jesus, and they are saying this is how we view the first 5 books of the Bible, from a rejection of Jesus and yet somewhat of a Jewish perspective. So that's that. That's why it's important to understand why Jesus rejected the Talmud. It's what makes this conversation relevant. Talmudic thinking influencing pro-choice thought within the Bible. Something else that I want to bring clarification on is the Septuagint. You know, as we walk through the interpretation of Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 and 23, I made note of the fact that Jesus took a Septuagintal translation or a Septuagintal understanding to the emphasis of those verses being on the life of the mother and the life of the child. Here's why that matters. I think there was a missing link in the sermon as to why the Septuagint is important. So let me explain. The Septuagint was written by 72 Hebrew scholars who were also fluent in the Greek language during the time period when the Greek Empire ruled the world. If you remember from history and school, the Greek Empire came along and they tried and made attempts to Hellenize the world, to bring Greek culture and thought and language to the entire world. So naturally, in the Bible, the Jewish people were exiled from their homeland, and then because they were dispersed abroad and they were no longer congregating and existing in Israel, and they no longer had a temple for worship, what the Jewish people would do, scattered all abroad throughout the face of the world, was for the first time, they started to gather in what's called synagogues. Gathering in synagogue and teaching the scriptures was the best thing that they had because they no longer had a temple to worship in properly living in the land of Israel. So when synagogues arose, all you had was Jewish individuals with a desire to teach what the Torah had to say and what the Old Testament had to say to their people. So fast forward to around, what would it be, 300 BC, before Christ, 300 years before Christ. These 72 Jewish scholars got together and they said, we need to make sure that we translate the Old Testament from the Hebrew language to the Greek language, because most of our people are losing their culture, they're losing their language, and now that they're studying in the synagogues, we need to make sure that we have a translation available for them so that they understand what the Hebrew scriptures were originally saying in their language today. It'd be the equivalent of English Christian scholars getting together today and translating an English translation of the Bible for you directly from the Hebrew and Greek. Because you and I don't speak Hebrew and Greek, we need to understand what the Bible is saying in our own language. So these scholars did so. They translated the Old Testament perfectly into Greek, and they did so because they had a concern that the Hebrew scriptures would eventually be destroyed, and we know many of them were, and we know that because the famous library in Alexandria, Egypt, that was destroyed, and it's been said that there was a lot of Hebrew documentation in there. So the question is how do you know that the Septuagint translation, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, how do you know that it's valid? Well, you know that it's valid because Jesus quotes from it. Again, Matthew chapter 4, Jesus is tempted 3 times by Satan. And Jesus responds 3 times by referring to the book of Deuteronomy, which is in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and he responds in the Greek language. Jesus would have had access to Hebrew. If anything, Jesus already knew Hebrew, and he's the one who inspired the scriptures. So with that being said, Jesus intentionally chose to quote from the Greek translation, which means that he approved of the Greek translation. So if Jesus is approving of the Greek translation, then how we read Exodus chapter 21 matters. Again, the Talmudic thinking on Exodus 21 said that the emphasis is only on the life of the mother, and that life for life would not be the penalty for a miscarriage or if the baby literally fell out of the woman. That, I think, be an improper interpretation. What Jesus does for us by affirming the Septuagint is he shows us that we can take confidence in the Greek translation of Exodus 21, verses 22 to 23. And in that translation, it's quite clear that there's an inference to life for life being both for the woman and the child. With that being said, it's important to understand the Talmud. It's important to understand the Septuagint. And then the last one would be the topic of creationism versus traditionism. And I mentioned from the sermon that creationism is not to be confused with how Christians typically think of a creationist approach to the first 6 days of creation. No, creationism versus traditionism in this argument means essentially how one believes, or when one believes the soul is inserted into the body. A creationist would say that God creates a fresh, new soul for every single individual. And as he creates a fresh, new soul, he then transplants that soul into a physical body at some point during the gestational period. I have problems with that position for a number of reasons. Number one, if God inserts the soul into the body at any given point in time after conception, then that leaves a window of time open for what's in the womb to not be considered human. So for example, if God were to insert the soul 1 week after conception, then at least for a week, you can't consider that a human being. If God were to insert the soul 6 months into the gestational period, then for 6 months you can make an argument that that individual in the womb is not a human being, so on and so forth. which would then give rise or credence to aborting something in the womb if it doesn't have a soul, if that makes sense. I think another problem with the creationist approach, where God would supposedly take the soul and insert it into the body, is it would put God at fault for taking a pure soul that he supposedly created from the start and to place it into a sinful body, right? That would make God the one at fault for contaminating the soul. But God doesn't produce sinners. Sinners produce sinners. People who are fully mind, body, soul, and spirit create other people who are mind, body, soul, and spirit. So I reject a creationist approach because I think it would put God at fault for contaminating the soul. Instead, I take a Traditionist approach, which would say that God was creating in the first 6 days, but now God mediates his creation thereafter, which means I think God has given mankind the capacity in man's seed to bring about a fully soulish, fully physical human being in the womb. With that being said, I don't think God creates brand new souls. I think God created human beings with soul and body. And as Genesis chapter 5, verse 3 alludes to, Adam had his child Seth in his own likeness. I think this interpretation would make more sense for why sin is passed down from Adam, because you have sinners at the soul level giving rise to more human beings at the soul level, and therefore the sin of Adam can be passed down in that system. In that system, the soul never gets contaminated. In fact, the soul is just born contaminated by sin, which I think is a better argument from Romans chapter 5. Whereas, death entered into the world through one man, and through one man, death spread to all men. That argument. I think another reason why the Traditionist argument is probably the best position to take is that it makes more sense. It makes more sense according to the pattern of Genesis chapter 1, where things that God creates then produces directly after their kind. So I think God mediates a new soul, but I don't think God creates a new soul and individually inserts it into the body one at the point of conception. I think things are passed down from spiritual beings. So with that being said, this provides some deep theological discussion. This is healthy for us to understand anthropology, what we believe about the human person. It's healthy for our understanding of sin, all of those things. It's also healthy for us to understand all of these concepts as it pertains to the deep discussions about what the Bible has to say about life. Indeed and in fact, what is it that a man and a woman create at the moment of conception? It's not it's not a clump of cells. In fact, what it is they create a whole human being with soul and physicality, material from the very start. All right, it's a long video. I hope this is a great additional resource. Take care, and we will see you this Sunday as we tackle some common objections to the pro-life position and as we tackle a number of questions and rationales from the world on the issue of abortion. So with that being said, please pray for this coming weekend. We hope to see you there. God bless.